This is late in the day, late in the conference. So like I said, I totally speak at conferences, and I get it. When you're at this point in the schedule, it's like, man, if anybody comes, this is a bonus. So, all right. So if you're here today, we're here to talk about Kubernetes. We're here to talk about ngrok. Who's familiar with ngrok? A little bit? Okay. Awesome. So you'll learn a little bit. What's interesting is, and I'll go into this in detail, if you know ngrok, you probably don't know about what we're doing today. A lot of what we're known for is what we've been doing in the past. And so that's what I'm gonna talk about today. The interesting thing is the whole talk is about overcoming complexity, which seems to be the theme of SUSE, of Rancher, of this conference when they were talking about in the keynotes, where they were talking about how SUSE runs anywhere, Rancher runs anywhere. ngrok fits right in. It's an ingress platform that allows you to provide ingress anywhere. You access to your application, no matter if it's on a public cloud, private cloud, on a local data center, or on your laptop. Same settings apply because you're passing, your traffic is passing through ngrok. And so with software, it's interesting because we have software to reduce complexity. We had problems we wanted to solve that we didn't want to handle ourselves, and so we write code to solve those problems. However, as we write lots of code, which isn't easy to write and is complex, it becomes increasingly more complex. I write an application on my machine, and I pass it over to you, and what's the famous line? Works on my machine. Right? But it may not work on yours because your dependencies might be slightly different. You might have a different version of the operating system or a different version of a library. And so as we've progressed, we say, okay, well then let's try to standardize everything. Let's put everything in a container. That way in the container, we can keep our dependencies, we can keep the application code, and it can all be the same, and I can ship it over to you, we can ship it up to staging, we can ship it into production, and it should all work. However, when we started using containers, we realized, well, it's not just a single container as my application. I'm going to have lots of containers in my application. And so now I need to start thinking about how I'm going to get all these containers to get along and to work together. And so we took the containers, we shoved them in pods, and one of the solutions was to have something called Kubernetes, and Kubernetes allows us to orchestrate all of those containers. I'm assuming everyone's pretty familiar with Kubernetes, yes? Yeah, great. So inside Kubernetes, then, we understand that there's lots of different pods. They communicate with each other through services. That's how they communicate inside the cluster. But if you have an application, if you have software that people are going to be using, you need them to be able to get to it. And that's where ingress comes into play. And ingress is that piece of your Kubernetes setup that allows you to pass, or allows other users to access your application. Now, ingress in and of itself is simple, but it's all complex because ingress is controlled by ingress controllers, and an ingress controller is usually tied to a specific vendor who does a specific thing. In the case of Nginx, super popular ingress controller. Probably most people in here are using Nginx, I would guess. But it provides a proxy so that your cluster has an address and you can actually get to it as a user. But it doesn't have load balancing, so we have a load balancer that is an addition to that ingress controller. And that load balancer is tied to whatever environment you're in, so it's either going to be running in AWS, it's with the AWS load balancer, you'll be in Microsoft, you have a Microsoft load balancer, if it's in Google, Google load balancer. If you're running it yourself, you'll have to configure your own. And so if you needed to set up your application in those places or move your code to various places, you have to think about all those other pieces outside of your ingress controller to provide that ingress, that access to your application. Now, I'm assuming most folks understand what Rancher is. If you don't, if you have questions about Rancher, there are hundreds of amazing experts outside that door that are here at SUSECon. The main thing to remember about Rancher is it essentially provides a way for you to run Kubernetes anywhere. It's the same experience whether you're going to be on AWS or whether you're going to be on your own data center or whether you're running it, again, locally on a laptop if you want to. You'll have that same dashboard experience. You want to think about how all those different things relate to one another when you're getting into EKS or getting into GKE or all the different acronyms that you have on the different clouds. So I'm not going to dig too far into Rancher, but I am going to dig into ngrok. I'm going to let you know what ngrok is, how it can help, and how it fits well with Rancher. So essentially, the little bit of background on the company, it started 10 years ago, actually, 2013. Our founder worked at a company called Twilio. Who's familiar with Twilio? Anybody? Little bit heard of it. It's essentially a service that allows you to manage text messaging and phone calls programmatically. It's like an API for text messaging in a sense. And so you can imagine with those events coming in, you have a lot of webhooks that happen inside of Twilio. And that's what he worked on. He worked in this area that he needed to be able to consume webhooks. And a webhook needs a publicly accessible address to hit. It can't hit your local machine. It has to be able to hit something that's publicly accessible to the internet. So he developed this little utility and thought, wow, this is pretty cool. Shared it with his team. They thought, wow, this is pretty cool. Then he shared it with the community. And holy moly, wow, they thought it was pretty cool. As an open source project, it exploded. And he realized, wait a second, if it has this kind of traction as a project, why couldn't I build a company around this thing? And to make a longer story a little shorter, we'll just say that over the years, he has built out a team around the product. That team has added more features, and the users just keep going up. Today, last I heard, there was about 7 million users of ngrok today. And it was bootstrapped all the way up until last year, 2 years ago, 2022. 2022, they had some ideas of, let's take this thing from being a developer tool and let's expand it into more production use cases, such as working with Kubernetes. How it started, it's a famous meme right on the internet, how things started, how's it going? How it started and how it still runs today. There's a lot of folks that still use this. I use this. This is the bread and butter of ngrok. It's the command line utility where you essentially say the protocol you want it to run on, you give it the port you want it to listen on, and then if you want to specify a domain, great. In fact, I recommend it because ngrok could assign one for you. However, every time you cut your session and then start it up again, you get a new domain. And so that kind of is hazardous if you're trying to do things in production. In testing, not so bad. And so in this case, you have this endpoint that is receiving traffic. It's going through the ngrok platform and then being routed to that service running on port 80 on my machine or wherever this is running. When that traffic is passing through the ngrok platform, it avails you to various features that we've added, such things like authentication. You can put OAuth at this layer. Rather than thinking about writing OAuth functionality and logic inside your application, you just set a flag and say, I want to use Google OAuth or GitHub OAuth, and boom, it just does it for you, which is nice. Load balancing, if you want to restrict IP, those types of things are available for you as you pass that traffic through the ngrok platform. You can even take that traffic as it's passing through and now analyze it. You could export it to something like Datadog or Stateful Stack, right? Isn't that the one that SUSE just acquired yesterday? Same type of thing. You could pump those events over to a tool like that and analyze the traffic that's passing through. But as we do that, you don't have to use that CLI tool anymore. You can. But there's also SDKs. If you're writing Go applications, JavaScript applications, Rust, Python, there's SDKs that allow you to embed that ingress inside of your application. So you could set it up on your laptop as you're developing it, and then when you push it to production or staging, all of those ingress settings are the same, again, because it's passing through ngrok. And then also, we have a Kubernetes operator. Essentially, the story is that we began as a developer tool, still a developer tool, but also expanding into application delivery. So that way doesn't matter where your code is running, ngrok can ngrok can handle that ingress for you. And here's the why. Our founder, Alan, essentially said this. He didn't essentially say this. He did say this. He says this a lot. But think about this. In all the other realms of our software development lifecycle, we've abstracted out layers and layers and layers to make things easier, faster, more efficient, better quality. Think of all the different higher level languages that we use today. And then on top of that, I mean, JavaScript's pretty darn high level, but then on top of JavaScript, you have all these different frameworks because people want to get things done faster or in a more uniform sort of way. Or if I'm using an API, you're probably not going to sit there and say, oh, well, now I need to I need to do the logic for setting up an HTTP request and then receiving those HTTP responses and then manipulating that response into objects that I need to run in my application. If I'm using a new API, I'm going to say, okay, does that API have an SDK? Because that'd be a lot easier. Because then I can just use that SDK and deal with it quickly rather than rewriting or essentially reinventing the wheel. And so this is the thought behind what Alan's thinking with networking today. I was in a meeting with him yesterday, and he was saying that in the future, developers shouldn't have to know how to set up connectivity to their application. They just need to know that it has a URL, and this is what it is. So that's the high level. I'll get into the details of exactly what's going on with ngrok. So you have this origin service, which is essentially your application code, right? And your application code's sitting behind a firewall, so it has the ngrok agent in there with it. So whether it's that terminal CLI that's running, if it's in the SDK, whether it's in Kubernetes as an operator, it's still there with your application code. When it creates a session, when it starts a session, that agent will first reach out to ngrok with an auth token that you were given when you created an account. That's to keep everybody safe. It's to keep you safe, it's to keep us safe, it's to keep other users safe, right? We have auth tokens so we can identify traffic, and if you're doing something not fun, we'll let you know about it and that sort of thing. Because we want everybody to play nice. And so we have that traffic, it comes out, it specifies a domain. Whether you specify it or we specify it, it doesn't matter, but you're going to get a publicly accessible domain. And then that creates an endpoint that is accessible to your users all over the world. We have points of presence all over the world. We're still working on a few sections of the world, but these are the areas that we have so far. And so making it possible for your users to get your applications easily and efficiently, coming through our points of presence and then being routed to your application. So the customers access that endpoint from anywhere in the world, and then ngrok validates or verifies the request. So the request comes in, and you may have rules that you can set up to say, I only want traffic that's going to be from this IP range, or I only want traffic that has been authenticated through OAuth, so that you can say only that traffic is going to hit your application. ngrok can act as a filter so that you're not getting overrun by requests that could be slowing you down as well. And then after we filter that, it comes in here and your request hits your origin service or your application code. So think about how that works as far as in general, like in concept of passing that information into your application. And so last year, we developed a Kubernetes operator. And that operator essentially sits inside your cluster as an ingress controller, because last year it was ingress, essentially that was the standard. And so it works as that point of entry for your cluster. However, as things go, and as you all know, we were talking a touch before I started, it seems you all pretty familiar with Kubernetes, so you understand that while this was the standard a year ago when we developed our ingress controller, with ingress, you have the point of entry. It's a straightforward way of providing access to your cluster, where you have an ingress controller, it provides entry, you set rules, it routes the traffic to the various services, which routes the traffic to the various pods, depending on whatever rules you set inside of your ingress settings. However, the main thing with this, or the main, I would say, shortcoming that folks have pointed out with the ingress approach is the fact that it doesn't allow for separation of concerns, so that when there's multiple roles or multiple people working on this type of connectivity, that you keep only the things that they need to manage within their realm of expertise and within their access. So in this case, if I come to gateway API, with the gateway, there's a couple more objects. Rather than just one single ingress object anymore, you're going to have a gateway class, which can be run by a kind of a higher-up person who says, this is the overall gateway idea that we're going to go with. And we're going to say, I'm going to be the infrastructure provider, and I'm going to say, with the gateway class, we're going to use this provider over here, this ngrok provider, and that's going to be our tool for providing a gateway into our application. And then the gateway object is the level where you start setting things like your TLS configurations, things like your certificates, things like your host names. These, again, you could have a separate role that says, OK, I only have control over making these changes of setting up the certificate settings and the domains and things, but that's it. And then your application developers who want to be manipulating your ingress settings, they basically just want to fix or work on what relates to their code. They are going to be working on the routes that route traffic to their specific services, and they can have access to those without the fear that maybe some lesser experience or just an engineer who may not be quite as aware that they could bring down the entire ingress for the application or the entire gateway for the application. They would just be dealing inside the route. And so if they did something they weren't aware, it would just be their route that dies and not the entire gateway for the entire application. So if you hold them side by side, you see the simplicity of ingress and gateway. While a touch more complex to get going, it definitely provides a way to keep it a little bit more separated of concerns. Some of the details here, the fact that, we talked about how ingress was stable. Ingress controllers, they're optimized only to run on layer 7 of the networking OSI model, which is basically that high level where it's just HTTP, HTTPS. The exciting part is that gateway is going to be looking at L4 and L7. So L4 is things like TCP traffic, which makes us excited because ngrok can run on TCP traffic. When this is generally available to the public, we're there. We're not there yet because they're not there yet, but this is definitely in the plans as far as the gateway spec. But that's enough slide stuff. Let's actually look at some code.
Is there a minimum Kubernetes version where new API is present? I don't even know. It exists. I don't know what version.
You know what's interesting? I know that, you'll see my demo that I'm about to kick off. We actually have to install CRDs to use the gateway objects, even still. And so I think that's how they get around it. They say, oh, just install these CRDs. Doesn't matter what version. But I do think there is a minimum version, but I don't know that answer. Yeah. So, but yeah, there's literally, you led me right into what I'm showing you in about 2 minutes. So let's see. OK. So what I have here, I have a couple of things. One is that I have a Rancher instance right here that I set up on AWS. What's nice is they have an amazing quick start guide if you're brand new to this thing. Is they have a repository that has Terraform files that allow you to just spin these things up. And so in my case, where I'm setting up demonstrations, this is very nice because I can do a Terraform apply, fire this thing up, mess things up, Terraform destroy, fire it up, And while it is still AWS and probably takes about 5 minutes each time, not kidding, but it's super handy. In this case, I have a cluster here. And then you have access to either get into a shell or also import some YAML. In this case, I'm going to get into a shell, and I need to set an environment variable. Now, the reason why I didn't do this before, you might think, Scott, why didn't you do this before? You knew you'd be sitting in front of a bunch of brand new friends, and you want to show them your auth tokens. No, I don't. And so why would you sit here and set your environment variables now? What I've learned is this particular shell has a certain time on it, and I'm not sure what that is, but when it dies, it totally clears out your environment variables. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually just going to put right now, and I'm going to set my environment variables. I will tell you that's what I'm doing. So just trust me. I set 2 environment variables. We'll see them later in my code. So now I set them in my bash RC. I'm going to source it. so that I can actually use those variables. And the steps that I'm about to go through, I have recorded in a repository if you want to look at it later. In fact, that's what I'm going to reference right now. And so I'm going to come here and to my SUSEcon demo. And the first thing you need to add to use the ngrok gateway operator, or the Kubernetes operator, is you need to install the repo, the ngrok repo, into Helm, into your local Helm repository, just Helm instance. And so, nope, that's it right there. And so I come here, that way I can install the Helm chart that is for ngrok. And then now what we also need to do, I love that I keep pulling that one up. Okay, and so we'll come here. And we need to, as my friend just asked, is there a specific version of Kubernetes? I forgot to restate the question because they can't hear it on the microphones. So if there was a specific version of Kubernetes that is required for Gateway, I think my initial answer is I don't know, but I think is the way you can get around it is you install these specific CRDs, which is from the Kubernetes special interest groups, the Gateway API, and it's the standard just one version 1.0.0 for that. All right, so we'll come into here. We'll install those. Pray that the conference internet, oh yeah, conference internet's just fine. Perfect. All right, and so now I have the different objects that I'll be using. Things like the gateway class, gateways, and HTTP routes. Those are the things that we'll be focusing on today. And so I'm going to come back over here to here, and here's how I'll install my Helm chart. The interesting thing is ngrok is available inside of the Rancher marketplace. If you wanted to go into the apps and install ngrok, you can. Totally works. But that only gets the ingress controller for using ingress and not necessarily for using the gateway API. And so because we're talking about the gateway API today, we have to do it this way by hand in the command line because we're passing an additional flag. You have to say use experimental gateway API because all this stuff is new. And also you might notice that while I'm talking about Kubernetes operator, and yet naming things is hard. We got the project started when we were an ingress controller, not really knowing that we were also going to include the gateway API inside of the ingress controller. So the product, or the package is still called the Kubernetes ingress controller inside of ngrok. However, it is our operator that also has gateway inside of it. Like I said, 3 hardest things in programming, right? Naming things and off by 1 errors. Exactly. Okay, so we'll come in here. We'll install my Helm chart. And we'll know that it's happy when it gives us this output where it says, hey, everything looks great. Here's how you could create ingress if you want to, sort of thing. And so now what I want to do is start thinking about the YAML that we're going to be adding. And so I'm going to come into here. We're going to look at the code. And like I said, all of this code is available on GitHub. I'll have a link at the end. We're setting up is it resolution good in the back? Yeah, great. And so we're setting up a service, and that simple service is essentially working with a deployment that's going to be using a container for the 2048 game. You'll see what I'm talking about. If you don't know what I'm talking about now, when you see it, you'll go, oh yeah, that game. But it's a 2048 game. The image is already available on Docker Hub. That stuff is there just to let you know what the application is. But here's the interesting part. So we have our gateway class, and that gateway class is, remember that each of these could be managed by different roles inside your organization. For the sake of the demonstration, we put them all in the same file. So here, it's basically saying the specification is going to be the gateway controller for ngrok, and then our gateway object is going to refer back to that class name. It says, okay, let's make sure we use that gateway class name. And then here, I'm going to set up the host name, the listener, using this specific host name. So I'm giving it a URL of Scott, GTW, AWS, SUSEcon, running on that port, and then we can set up our TLS settings here. You can use ngrok self-signed certs here, or you can specify the cert you want to use up there as well, if you have your own certs and you want to control those, which makes sense. And then for this all to work, you need to set up at least one route. That one route is that rule that takes the traffic and says, all right, I'm going to take traffic at this host name, and I'm going to pass it into this service, so my service, the game 2048. All right. Come back in here. There's a few different ways that you can run the YAML code here. We're just going to import the file. Rancher AWS. Make sure you have your correct namespace. Everything looks great. If you notice, I'm a developer advocate. I like pointing out the potholes in the trail, right? The things that kind of go, huh? Notice I do believe the question marks mean that those are objects those are the gateway, all the different gateway objects. I believe that's because it's so new that Rancher hasn't caught up to that yet. That's my thought. Because that's the only time you see the question mark. Everything looks great except for our deployment. Deployment has something about minimum availability. Let's dig into that. Oh, now it's changed to running. So that's enough there. So that was nice to have that experience, to be able to see that there. Can we kill you? There we go. All right. So now we can go check our application. What was my URL that I used? This one. This is when I pray to the demo gods. Yep, didn't work. All right. So, yeah, trust me when it does normally work. So essentially what would happen is that we would have seen our application running. I do have it running on DigitalOcean, and so we'll show you that there, but I don't. Yeah, I was having issues with it this morning, and there's been some bugs. So let's see. So now what we can do is to show you that I'm not making this up. Let's go over here. Let's do our DigitalOcean thing here. And so we have our, no, come on now. It was literally running when I walked out of my hotel room not an hour ago. Of course it did. All right, so this is the wonderful, the fact that my demos were also both not working. So what I can do is I can come over here, I can look at yeah, okay. Essentially, what that would have done is create an application so that we could have accessed it through the gateway there. So that's a bummer. Let's try one more thing. So what we can actually do is I can come here into my AWS. I can look inside my terminal real quick, see if there's anything that we can see quickly. Everything got created. Okay. And then I can say, if we come in here, and if, remember, we had our, do I still have that? I don't. The CRDs that we added, I never remember the full name of those, and so I'm actually going to come out here. I'm going to do this so I can get this here. It's going to give me the names again while it says it doesn't install them, but it just gives me the names again. And I can come back out here to that class right there. And here, to debug this, I would come in here and I would say get that there. And then I would say that. That's the one I have there. And then I can say, okay, so that works. And then let's do that. Check this one thing. There's a certain point when you debug a demo or debug something in front of an audience where it becomes less about you and more about me and my fight with the demo. And so I'm going to be careful about that. I realize we have a little bit of time, so I'm going to dig in just a little bit, but then I'll probably move on. And so ngrok, ingress. It's always harder typing in front of other people. Ingress controller. There we go. Oh, right. Well, we see errors. All right, can't fix it now. So I'm going to have to bail on that part. Let's see. So we had that. Interesting part with AWS and DigitalOcean is you have the same settings. So you have the same settings whether you are in Rancher. If we come here, I mean, all of our Rancher settings are the same except for this one's in a cluster called Quick Start AWS, and this one's in a cluster called Quick Start DO. But we would have the same objects here and get all there. And we would come here and we would say, yep, these look great. Actually,
I think you passed it.
I
think you passed it.
Did I pass it? Oh, yeah, I did. Okay, yes. So these are there. We have that there. And the interesting thing about the ingress or the gateway code, if I come and look at this DigitalOcean code and I put it right next to the AWS gateway code, it's essentially identical, right? I mean, we can have them here, and these are all the same. The difference is I come down here to the gateway class, or the gateway object here. And the only difference is the host names for our application. So your application, if you're running it on each of the different platforms, you can still have the same manifest files. So that way, so take this scenario into thought. I wrote a GitHub action a few months back where I could basically take the manifest that I was going to be using for production, but I set the host name to be like a test URL, so that when I ran through a GitHub action, it pulled that manifest, created a Kubernetes cluster to test, ran some automated tests on it, and then killed it. And then when it pushed to production, it just changes that host name to production and then pushes that into production, which is nice because then you're not only testing that your application works, that the code works, but you're testing to make sure that your Kubernetes manifest files also, that those work, because they would have to be correct for the application to run. So it's a super interesting idea there. There was going to be a bit where I was going to talk about some gateway or API gateway features that we have inside of ngrok. However, I can't show it to you now because I wasn't able to spin up my game. But just know that we can add various pieces into that configuration. If we wanted to essentially, manipulate our headers that are passing through, if you have some headers passing into your application, if you have JOT validation that you want to implement inside of your application, or request routing, you could route things to different spots, or have some rate limiting. In fact, I'll show you the code for what this did. It's all being run by this traffic policy engine that we have inside of ngrok. And so essentially what you can do is all those different features that I was mentioning. What I'm doing today is I'm going to have a traffic policy, and we'll make this go away. And so inside here, how I would add an additional HTTP route is I would say, just give it a route, refer to the parent, so the gateway parent, which is that ngrok gateway that we have inside the namespace. You still have to specify the host names to make sure that this rule is happening on this specific host. And then here, you're routing it to that service, but then applying this filter right here. And in this filter, I can say, all right, so whenever a request comes in, I want to say the fact that I'm going to give it a header that says, is this gateway, is it true? And then say, sag hello, right? Doesn't that say hello in German? Yes? Close? No? Okay. And then the country. I can show you where you would actually see this, and then we remove the refer header. I'll actually show you on one of my previous trial runs that I was doing this on. And so what I can do here is I'll come back out here to the ngrok. We'll go into here. I'll look at my traffic. We have something called the traffic inspector. How I was mentioning, you have that observability tool. This is that tool that you can come into your ngrok account. You can say, here's all the traffic that's passing through. As you notice, I have a domain here. It's this was back when I was having fun with the demonstration. I have a URL that says please, because I was hoping it would work. It did work in that time. And so if I come here, we didn't set the headers on that particular one, so I'm not going to check that one. In fact, I'm going to have to go back a little. Well, actually, I think we did on number 3. So I'm going to come here. We'll look at that one. And so here I can look at my headers, and I come here and I can say, nope. We didn't manipulate headers on this one. So what about that one? There we go. Yep. All right. So in here, those headers, because as this traffic is coming into our application, when it hits ngrok, it will say, all right, I'm going to set the country code to DE. I'm going to remove that referrer header, like I told it to, set the is gateway to true, and then say sag hello, which is hello SUSE-con. You can manipulate those requests so that when it hits your application, it can handle whatever you want it to do. So when your application receives that information, it can act on that. Traffic inspector, something that we just showed, has a 3-day retention period before it clears things out. I do believe you can adjust that depending on your account and the agreements you can set. But it's super nice because there was a friend I was talking to that saw this and said, oh, I need to be able to debug something. And I can not only debug it, I can not only see what's happening, I can actually hit replay and say, I just want to replay this one and see how it's affecting my application. Rather than asking the customer to keep doing it, I can just sit there and replay it and say, okay, now how does that work? So I can replay it and make it keep hitting my code and see what's going on. If you would like to give us feedback, aside from the fact that it didn't work today in my demonstration, be happy to give you ngrok Pro, which is the Pro license for 90 days. If you scan that, it's a completely manual process. It's not going into any sort of HubSpot or anything. It goes into a Smartsheet spreadsheet for me, and I will personally email you. And so when you see that email in your inbox, even though it looks probably, I don't know how to word it so it doesn't look like spam, but you can get an account, use it for 90 days, and have all the features that you would need to be able to test things out. And then let us know. Then let me know how it worked for you, whether it met your needs, or would it be something cool that you would want to use, or why it wouldn't, because that's equally as important to learn. All right. Well, I'd love to continue the conversation. If you'd like to get a hold of me afterwards, I'll be here for the rest of the conference, which is another hour or so. but also you can find me on any of the socials as well. But thank you all for coming.